They've impacted the lives of many friends, family, and the fact that you're here demonstrates the relationships that my parents have made on their journey. The story we're celebrating tonight is one of faith, love, family, and friends. It is uniquely my parents' story, but it is also our story, as every person here tonight has played a role in this tale, and we thank you. I wish we had a better storyteller. Between my soft voice and my vision problems, I don't know if my parents could have asked for anybody who was more inept at doing this, but I'm going to do my best. As I tell my mom's story first, I'm going to be sharing most of it in her voice. So this is going to be as if she were speaking. Now, I'm not going to try and change my voice to be like her voice, but I'm going to be speaking as if she were the one that we're giving this presentation. When I'm getting acquainted with a new friend, I like to say that I'm from a very wealthy family. But then I quickly add, please don't misunderstand that. Our family did not have much money, but we were rich in things that money could never buy. We lived in a coal mining area called Coal Fork, about 7 miles from Charleston, West Virginia. My parents were Clifford and Ruth Pence. This is the 50th anniversary for my husband and me, and were they living, 2019 would be the 90th anniversary for my parents, who were married in 1929. My father was a coal miner. His work was challenging and dangerous, but he had many friends who worked beside him, and all the miners looked out for each other. Times were hard then, but my dad and my mother were the happiest people I've ever known. Their joy was passed on to us, and life was good. I have 3 brothers, Paul, Don, and Troy. I was the youngest and the only daughter. Since I was the baby, Dad spoiled me, and I loved every minute of it. Every evening, I waited for him to come home, and as soon as he was in sight, I ran to meet him, knowing that he would have a little treat in his lunch pail for me. At night, he would call for me to come into the kitchen, and we would have a party. First, he would sing a little song for me that went like this. We're having a little party, having it just for 2. We're having a little party just for me and Rita Lou. And from what I understand, that was my mother's, that was what most people called her when she was a girl, Rita Lou. Is that right?
That's right.
We lived in a very small home in Coal Fork Hollow. And also, I'm not a Southerner, so I'm going to mispronounce some of these words. It's spelled hollow, but it's pronounced holler. Is that right? Okay. Part of my ineptitude. I was in 1st grade and we moved to a nicer home about halfway down the holler. We were still a mile away from my school, so I had to leave home early to avoid being late. I remember that I ran or skipped most of the way until I caught up with my friends. I loved school and determined that when I grew up, I would be a teacher. One of my friends at church was 5 years older than I, but I always insisted on being the teacher. She didn't always enjoy being the student of someone 5 years younger than she, but I loved it. To this day, we are great friends. Dad and Mother were wonderful, godly people. Neither of them grew up in a Christian home, but as a young teenager, Mother attended a revival in the Methodist Church in Coal Fork and accepted Christ as her Lord and Savior. Dad attended the revival as well because he wanted to walk Mother home from church. However, when he listened to the evangelist preach about God's redemption plan, he also surrendered his heart to Jesus. After dating for a couple years, both realized that they deeply loved each other and would serve God together. As Mother and Dad started having children, they determined that they would serve God as a family. My parents joined the Pilgrim Holiness Church, which later became part of the Wesleyan Church. Dad became the song leader, and Mom was the pianist. And in that small church, we met people who would remain lifetime friends. My brothers, Paul, Don, Troy, and I began our spiritual journey at this church. The church offered youth services once a week. Teenagers were in charge of this program, and we often had Bible quizzes, songs, and prayer. Adults attended the youth services and prayed with us. That support encouraged and strengthened us on our spiritual journey. Our parents had our education as a high priority. Dad began working in the coal mines when he was 14 years old in order to support his parents and his siblings. His father had been injured in the mines and was unable to work. At the age of 11, Mother was sent from Pennsylvania to Coal Fork to live with her Aunt Rose. Her aunt was very unkind and often made Mother miss work or miss school to clean and to clean the house and cook. Mother was bright and eager to learn and have friends. However, she became discouraged when she was unable to go to school because her aunt, who liked to sleep late, insisted that she prepare breakfast and clean up the kitchen before leaving for school. While we were very young, Dad and Mom determined that we would get a college education. They wanted opportunities for us that they were never able to experience themselves. When I completed the 11th grade, my brothers called and asked our parents to move to Lansing, Michigan. Dad had suffered a broken leg while working in the mines, and Mother had lost her eyesight due to retinal detachments. The decision to leave Coal Fork was difficult for our parents, but they decided to go so our family could be together. Very quickly, Dad found a job working as a school bus driver and school custodian. He was delighted to be out of the mines and greatly enjoyed his new jobs. Mother adjusted to blindness and soon was cooking and cleaning house again, just as she had done for many years. Best of all, she was happy and content. All three of my brothers and I graduated from Michigan State University. Our parents' dream for their children's education had come true. My mom was a public school teacher for nearly 30 years, and now I'm going to transition from my mom's voice to my own. Thousands of students' lives were changed by not only her instruction in language arts, but also her compassion and mentoring. She established a strong drama program at her high school and helped her students find a means of expression through theater. She encouraged many students through difficult times. Just a few days ago, I received a letter from my mom's former boss, who we'd invited to come. Unfortunately, he sent his regrets that he and his wife weren't able to attend. And in the letter, he explained that when my mother started teaching at Bath High School, the school was on the verge of bankruptcy. It didn't have enough money for basic school supplies, and it didn't have any sort of a drama program at the time. It didn't even have a working public address system. So my mom and Dad both did quite a bit of volunteer work. My mom establishing the drama program at the school, and my dad donating equipment and using his expertise in the audio industry to install a working PA system. And it's amazing that after all these years, her former boss would remember that and remember how dedicated my mother was to her students and to the school system. Over the years, many of her students became close friends. I remember when I was in high school, it would not be unusual to have friends or to have students come over, and my mom would encourage them in various ways. And there are two of my mom's former students who are here tonight, Annie and Rita. And not only are they here, but they also helped decorate and help us in a number of ways tonight. And we just can't express how much we appreciate that. They've really become daughters to my mom, much more so than students. My mother was inducted into American Who's Who for educators, and I'm very proud of her achievements as an educator. But much more than that, I'm proud of her character. It's because of my mother's character that my brother and I learned to have good morals, learned to be concerned for other people, and because of her that we're the men that we are today. Matt and I know that we're blessed that God gave us such a wonderful mother. Thank you. Now we're going to transition from my mom's voice to my father's voice, and I'm going to do my best to tell my father's story in his words. I was born on February 1st, 1946 in Michigan to Opal Cooper and Audrey Spriggs. I was born in a small town in the thumb portion of the state, a short distance from Peck, Michigan, which is where the Spriggs family resided at the time. I was the younger of two boys, the other being Larry, who was about 7 years older. Mom and Dad were born and raised in northeastern Missouri and moved to Michigan in the late 1930s, where Dad's job was with the John Deere Company. Dad was born in 1911 to Earl and Leona Spriggs, and Mom was born in 1915 to Howard and Stella Cooper. Dad was one of 8 or 9 siblings born in very, very meager circumstances. The term abject poverty is accurate. Dad was a very handsome man. He was intelligent and a standout athlete. He was able to attend college for 1 year, but due to economic pressures had to seek employment that helped him contribute to the family and make his way in life. The Great Depression was tough on everyone, and while seeking employment, he was a member of the Civilian Conservation Corps. He worked for John Deere for more than 30 years, retiring in about 1970 on a health disability after rising through the ranks to a management position. Not a lot is known about my parents' courtship, but the records show that they were married on May 6, 1938. My father's parents did not attend church, but my mother's parents were devout churchgoers. My mother influenced my dad, and my brother and I were fortunate to grow up in a Christian home. I just knew that the technology was going to fail at some point. Fortunately, it recovered there. I was active in school, playing sports and music and doing all things common for teenagers. There was a strong work ethic in the Spriggs household, so there was little downtime. I mowed lawns, raked leaves, shoveled snow throughout my youth, but I also enjoyed regular employment, picking grapes and asparagus when they were in season and working in the local clothing store. But my true love was music, and I began consistently playing in music groups at the age of 15. I graduated from high school in 1964, and in the fall began studies at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. After a little more than a year, I enlisted in the U.S. Army on my 20th birthday on February 1st of 1966. And as an aside, an interesting thing about these two pictures, I didn't get to know my grandfather very well. Unfortunately, he passed away when I was only about 3 years old. But he was something of a perfectionist, I think it'd be fair to say. And this was my dad's senior picture, and that was just not good enough for Grandpa, so he tried to find the best photographer he could in the area, and that's what the accepted picture eventually was. I was supposed to enter the Navy in the fall of 1965 to attend the Naval Academy of Music. An untimely encounter with a pony resulted in an injury that upset those plans. At the height of the Vietnam conflict in 1966, I enlisted in the Army. Boot camp was fun. Now, I work with people from all branches of the military every day, and I think this might be the first time I've heard a veteran say that boot camp was fun. But he wasn't being sarcastic saying that. He's very sincere in that. One day after he arrived at boot camp, a master sergeant learned that he played the sax. The sergeant had a band that played several nights a week off base. So while I attended basic training during the days, I played music at night and made a few dollars in addition. After boot camp in Fort Knox, Kentucky, I was assigned to Fort Totten, New York. I could catch the train to downtown Manhattan. The Metropole Cafe was a must-stop where I would enjoy jazz luminaries such as Gene Krupa, Dizzy Gillespie, James Moody, Mo Allison, and countless others. One night, I was fortunate to enjoy Coleman Hawkins, the great tenor saxophonist. And speaking to the jazz band over here, I think it would have been something to have been young in those days and heard those people play. On February 1967, I received orders to report to Fort Halliburton, Maryland, for training in the field of intelligence collection. After a 5-month program, the entire class shipped to Vietnam in the summer of 1967. And again, stepping outside of my father's voice, this picture that I have is an interesting picture because my dad was enlisted in the military at the time this picture was taken. It's unusual for an active duty military person to be in a war zone and not be in uniform. With very few exceptions, my dad did not wear a uniform when he was in the war zone. But is that accurate? I asked my dad for his permission to share some detail about his experience in Vietnam. Combat exposure is traumatic and costly to those who serve. During the Vietnam War, some of the most intense fighting was during the Tet Offensive of 1968. And if you're not familiar with this history, I would encourage you to research it. My father was in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive of '68, and although young, he was a non-commissioned officer and had significant responsibility in collecting intelligence and leading other soldiers. When he was deployed to Bien Hoa, he was tasked with delivering material to a base there. My father's job in the military required him to be in civilian clothing. And an enemy combatant who is caught in a war zone wearing civilian clothing can be executed immediately. That's one of the risks that go with not being in uniform in a war zone. While in Bien Hoa in February of '68, the base my father was serving in was overrun by the enemy. In fact, he wasn't serving there. He was just there on temporary assignment, delivering some material. While he was there, the base security was almost immediately wiped out when it was overrun by the enemy. My dad was with a group of soldiers who were up on the roof of one of the buildings, and they were firing down upon the enemy, trying to prevent them from infiltrating the inner perimeter of the base and wiping out the surviving U.S. troops. By God's mercy, eventually air support arrived, and the enemy were defeated. And while my father was exposed to combat in other situations after that, there was nothing else that was quite as traumatic due to the loss of life and imminent threat of death. My father has never publicly shared these events, but it's a story that should be told. There were brave men that lost their lives in that battle. And then there were brave men like my father that fought to prevent the deaths of the other men in their unit and their own survival at great personal cost. My dad told me that his transition back to civilian life was a greater culture shock, believe it or not, than adjusting to life in Vietnam. The culture in the U.S. had dramatically changed in the few years that he served in the Army. He worked briefly as a public school teacher, and although he loved helping people, he soon realized that being an educator really was not his calling. My dad's career was in the audio industry. He retired after more than 30 years working in the audio industry, and the majority of his career was in management of audio companies such as Biodynamic and Alltech Lansing. Prior to his corporate work, my dad was a contractor and installed many sound systems in churches and schools in the state of Michigan. My mother-in-law passed away nearly 3 years ago, and she was a big admirer of my dad. She really admired his strong work ethic and his skills at home repair. And she would often comment, sometimes to me and sometimes to Julie, how unfortunate it is that her son-in-law did not inherit his father's ability to fix things or his father's work ethic. And Julie often repeats that to me in one fashion or another. Usually she'll say it in different words, but usually at the end of it is, "Dave, why can't you be more like your dad?" And I really wish I could. My dad has sacrificed for others his entire life. Whether giving financially, fixing something, or helping to solve a problem, my dad is always trying to help someone, most of all his family. Matt was in a sane group in his 20s, and my dad spent a lot of time helping Matt with this endeavor. And my dad helped me in countless ways as I was completing my education financially by providing housing for Julie and me while I was completing graduate school. Dad, your life would have been a lot less complicated if not for Matt and me. Matt and I are truly blessed that God gave us such a wonderful father. At this point, we're going to change gears again and transition back into my mom's voice, telling about their courtship and marriage. In 1969, Jerry's mother, my grandmother, Opal Spriggs, and Don Pence's wife, Carolyn, worked together in probate court in Lansing, Michigan. Jerry's mother had recently moved to Lansing from Paw Paw, Michigan. His mother told Carolyn their son Jerry had recently returned home from Vietnam and that he had no friends in Lansing. Consequently, he was returning to Paw Paw to see his old friends. Carolyn told Jerry's mom that her sister-in-law Rita was a member of their church and that she should bring Jerry to her church to visit. Possibly he could find some friends there. On Mother's Day, Jerry came to church with his mother, and she and Carolyn introduced Jerry and me. And this is my mother speaking, of course. And I'm just going to take a brief aside and let all of you know that when Julie and I were dating, my parents cautioned us many, many times to make sure that we take plenty of time to get to know each other and that we don't get married impulsively. We don't get married, without just making sure that this relationship is right. You cannot make such an important decision in a brief amount of time. That week, he called me and asked me if I would like to go out to dinner with him. Of course, I said yes, and I was excited but a bit nervous. We did not know each other, and perhaps he would not like me. Our first date went well, and we found it easy to talk to each other. For our second date, Jerry invited me to go with him to see the two-part movie, War and Peace. Now, if I were going to go out on a date, if I had a hot date, and I knew that I was not going to be paying attention to the movie at all, War and Peace would probably be the movie that I would take my date to see. Halfway through the second night of the movie, I decided that was the longest movie I'd ever seen. We were enjoying our time together, so we continued to see each other throughout the week. I think my mom left a lot out. At the beginning of our second week of dating, Jerry called and asked me if he could pick me up at 7 o'clock in the evening. I said that I'd be ready. At 6:45, our doorbell rang. I was excited. I went to the door knowing it would be Jerry, but it wasn't. A young man who lived outside of Lansing often dropped in as he was passing through. We dated a few times, but we didn't seem very compatible. He brought slides to show me some of the places he'd visited. 7:15 came and Jerry had not arrived. I thought surely he'd driven by and saw the visitor's car, so he just drove off, and I was so sad and believed I'd never see him again. However, at 7:45, the doorbell rang, and it was Jerry. I thought now he will be really mad, and I will never see him again. I did not know what to do. However, when I opened the door, Jerry walked in and said hello. Then he walked over to the other guy, shook his hands, and said, "Hi, I'm Jerry." My other friend said, "I was just showing some slides to Rita, so I'll be going now." Jerry replied, "Here, let me help you take your projector out to the car." So out the door we went, out the door they went, and my dad and mother started laughing. They'd never seen such a quick exit. I just hoped Jerry would come back in. He did, and we left to enjoy a wonderful evening together. And as a psychologist that often provides care to combat veterans when they're returning, I'm thinking about this man that just a few weeks ago was in heavy combat, and then there was someone threatening to take his girl away. I'm wondering how close that man knew he was to the end of his life. At the end of 2 weeks of dating, you heard that right, at the end of 2 weeks of dating, Jerry proposed to me. And Mom, you knew that eventually I was going to get you back for all the caution that you gave Julie and me for getting married. So this is my opportunity to do it. It was such a surprise that I did not know what to say. The one thing I did know, however, was that I was falling deeply in love with this bright and handsome young man. I did not know that Jerry had already asked my father for my hand in marriage. We'd met on Mother's Day, and now I began planning our wedding on August 16, 1969. Following our wedding, we honeymooned in Ocean City, Maryland and Washington, D.C. We then returned to East Lansing for me to start my 3rd year of teaching and for Jerry to continue his studies in criminal justice at Michigan State University following his military service in Vietnam. We were busy that first year, but very happy. I had a few cooking accidents, but Jerry was very tolerant and understanding. Early in our marriage, I decided to fix biscuits and gravy, certain that I could make them just like my mother. However, the biscuits were hard as rocks and the gravy was like glue. Jerry took a couple of bites, put down his fork, and said, "Honey, I know money is a bit tight right now, but has it really come to this?" Soon after we were married, Jerry joined the church where our family were members. The next year, he was elected to the church board and later became Sunday school superintendent. Our son David was born in the fall of '70, and our son Matthew was born 7 years later. We wanted very much for our boys to have a wonderful spiritual journey, so we kept them active in church. All too soon, they were grown and left home to pursue college and interests of their own. My parents have been married 50 years. It's amazing how quickly the time has gone by, and there have been many changes in our culture since that time period. I can't come close to providing a summary, but I'll give a few examples. There were no personal computers, cell phones, or pocket calculators back in those days. Although record players were available, live music was still relatively common at social gatherings, and again, jazz band, that would have been a good time to be a musician. You could go through the security line at the airport without taking your shoes off, and clergy and political leaders still had more trust in those days than a used car salesman. Those are just a few of the differences in the culture those days up until now. My parents raised 2 boys and helped raise 2 granddaughters. They both retired from successful careers in which they made a positive impact on many people. They enjoyed a number of fun and memorable trips, both within and outside of the United States. When Matt and I were growing up, my parents were often volunteering at church or in our community. My parents have been very supportive and loving to Matt and me. They were always there at our various school activities. They loved us and encouraged us during each phase of our lives. They brought us to church and taught us to have faith at an early age. They modeled for us the nature of a loving marriage and family. They maintained close relationships with many family and friends. Some of my parents' friends and a number of family members made the long drive here from Michigan. My mom and dad have lived a wonderful life, and we're helping them celebrate tonight. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for providing such a wonderful story for us to enjoy together. May the faith and love from your story continue to influence others in the positive manner it has through your 50 years together. May God's blessing and joy continue to fill your hearts as your story continues. And to all who helped us celebrate my parents' golden anniversary day, we thank you. Thank you for being a part of their story. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the time together tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Chad and the band.
Thank you.